Et quant à Francois Bugingo, il a réagi via Facebook. Il s'est dit sidéré par cette attaque en ajoutant qu'il défendrait son intégrité en temps et lieu.
I'd never heard of him before, but apparently Francois Bugingo is a famous journalist in Quebec. His beat was mainly foreign affairs, including reporting from war zones. He was very popular freelancer, worked for different media outlets, until it came out this week that he actually just made stuff up. He faked it, and it took years for the truth to catch up to him, for him to be fact-checked. Well, at first Bugingo said it was just all a smear campaign. It was, quote, a media lynching. Yeah, I don't think it was about racism, Mr. Bugingo. I think it was because you lied. In the end, he conceded that he was guilty of, quote, romanticizing the stories. He said he just wanted to entertain Quebecers. Well, then you should be an entertainer, not a factual journalist from a war zone. But the rest of the media in Quebec certainly jumped on Mr. Bugingo. This was a moment where they could all prove how righteous and ethical they were. But it got me thinking, at least Mr. Bugingo, after an initial denial, admitted what he did was wrong. How about the media party on their stories that they got wrong? And this isn't rogue individuals who pulled a fast one on an editor. These are whole media organizations that pulled a fast one together on their readers. Let me take, for example, the case of robocalls. Literally hundreds of stories throughout Post Media, mainly the Ottawa Citizen, by Glenn McGregor and Stephen Maher. They won awards for it. Their theory was dramatic, that there was some central conspiracy of high-up Conservative Party strategists that had a voter suppression plan to auto-dial, that's the robocall part, countless Canadians who they somehow identified were possible Liberal voters, telling them the wrong place to go vote, so then when they would show up at like an abandoned warehouse or something, they would get frustrated and not vote. I think that was the theory. It was laughable from the beginning, but here, just take a look at these breathless stories again and again, hundreds of times, and get a load of this from the CBC that was part of the robocall paranoia mania too. Take a listen to that.
And tonight, CBC News has learned the investigation is expanding.
The complaints have been pouring in from coast to coast.
It's a low-down scheme to take their right to vote away.
Voters in Saanich Gulf Islands received fake phone calls claiming to be from Elections Canada, telling people their polling stations had moved.
The stories come from candidates and voters.
I mentioned to my spouse that there was probably something very fishy, and that it was probably some sort of illegal activity.
In North Bay, Liberal Anthony Rota lost by just 18 votes.
Countries from around the world come to Canada and ask us to monitor their elections. They ask us to set up their elections. And suddenly we can't run an election, an honest election in our own country.
Yeah, in the end, it all came to nothing. There was one illegal robocall in Guelph, Ontario, some rogue guy who was sentenced to jail. But this grand national scheme, despite hundreds of breathless stories, it just wasn't there. I mean, it never made sense in the first place. But if you think that's a doozy, I think I got a worse one for you. Remember when Canada was in Afghanistan helping to liberate that country from the Taliban, to allow schoolgirls to go to school without having acid thrown on their face? It was a noble mission by Canadians. We lost over 150 men and women there, but Canada served proudly. Well, not according to the CBC. The CBC ran a breathless story accusing Canada of being complicit in war crimes. Here, take a look at this.
From the start, the opposition has been claiming that government officials turned a blind eye to the torture of Afghan prisoners. But what we're learning now is the suspicion that those hidden documents may reveal much worse than that. That the Canadians intended some prisoners to be tortured so as to gather intelligence. If true, that would be a war crime.
This is ugly. This makes Somalia look very small.
Amir Ataran is a law professor who's been digging deep into the Afghan file and says he's seen uncensored documents suggesting the real reason for all the secrecy.
If these documents were released, what they will show is that Canada partnered deliberately with the torturers in Afghanistan for the interrogation of detainees. There would be a question of rendition, and there would be a question of war crimes on the part of certain Canadian officials.
That is a shocking accusation. It's not just a speculation. It says with great conviction that Canada deliberately partnered with torturers for the interrogation of detainees, and worse, they knew it, and instead of bringing these war criminals to justice, the government is covering up as hard as it can. That is a shocking thing to say, and the CBC ran with it for years. Opposition politicians relying on the CBC retold those accusations in Parliament and in the media. It was such a smear on our troops. It surely affected morale. It was so bad that the Canadian government actually commissioned an elite panel to investigate, spending millions of dollars. They actually got former Supreme Court justices. They actually invited Stéphane Dion, the former Liberal leader, to be on this committee just so everyone knew it was nonpartisan. They reviewed tens of thousands of confidential and classified military and diplomatic and intelligence documents and found nothing. It was a fake. It was untrue. There was zero evidence of complicity with torture. In fact, the opposite. If there was a fear of torture, the soldiers didn't hand the prisoners over, let alone a deliberate cover-up. And so I put to you two damnable media party lies, both of which destroyed public respect for institutions. When Francois Bugingo told big fish stories, there was no real victim other than, I suppose, the truth. He didn't harm anyone or smear anyone. He just made himself into a big shot that he wasn't. But when the CBC and the Ottawa Citizen took a run at the robocalls lie for years, what was damaged is public respect for our democracy. And when Amir Adaran and the CBC took a run at our Canadian forces, they not only gave hope and comfort to the enemy, but they destroyed morale and destroyed the memory of 158 Canadian soldiers who died serving our country and freeing Afghanistan. When will they quit like Francois Bugingo did? For TheRebel.media, I'm Ezra Levant.